In Defense of Rational Criticism of Islam by Yamin, from the April-May 2026 issue of Free Inquiry. Introduction. The tyranny of the sacred in a secular age. In a world that claims to be progressively rational, the one sphere still cloaked in untouchable sanctity is religion. While Christianity and Judaism have been relentlessly dissected, criticized, parodied, and deconstructed in modern Western discourse, Islam alone enjoys a bubble-wrapped immunity enforced not only by the devout, but by a guilt-ridden intelligentsia, terrified of being labeled Islamophobic. This manufactured consensus is not a triumph of tolerance, it is a retreat from reason. Islamophobia, a term strategically designed to conflate criticism of Islamic doctrines with bigotry against Muslim individuals, is weaponized to silence legitimate intellectual scrutiny. In reality, what is demonized as Islamophobia is often a rational response to real-world ideologies that are antithetical to liberalism, feminism, human rights, and secular values. To fear the consequences of a belief system when those consequences are manifest in violence, oppression, and totalitarian control is not phobia, it is sanity. Recent events have underscored this dissonance. The brutal stabbing of Salman Rushdie in 2022 by a man radicalized by fatwas and ideological indoctrination was not a random act of madness. It was a direct consequence of Islamic blasphemy codes being taken seriously. The Iranian regime's open celebration of the attack, declaring it divine justice, received barely a whimper of condemnation from the so-called liberal guardians of speech. Where were the protests in London or New York for Rushdie's eye and hand? Where was the solidarity? Instead, we continue to see an inverted morality. Muslims portrayed as perpetual victims regardless of context, and critics, especially those from within the Islamic world, such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Maryam Namazi, or Salman Rushdie, branded as traitors or bigots. The defense of Islam, unlike any other religion today, is seen as a moral imperative by those who would never tolerate Catholic bans on abortion or evangelical repression of LGBTQ rights. Why the double standard? Because fear, dressed up as empathy, rules the discourse. Concern over Islam is not irrational hatred, but rather the final redoubt of Enlightenment thinking, a last-stand defense of reason against a rising tide of dogma cloaked in multicultural sensitivity. An examination of recent events across Europe, the Middle East, and South Asia illustrates that criticism of and opposition to Islamic dogma is not merely justified. It is necessary. Europe's cowardice. The case of France and the beheading of Samuel Paty. In October 2020, French schoolteacher Samuel Paty was beheaded in the street by an 18-year-old Chechen Muslim named Abdullah Anzarov after Paty showed his students caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad in a class on free speech. The teacher had taken every precaution, offering students the chance to leave the room, contextualizing the material, and framing it within French Republican values. But none of that mattered. His head ended up on the pavement, and the murderer proudly posted photos online. Anzarov's justification? Blasphemy. The French state reacted with brief rhetorical strength. President Emmanuel Macron declared that Islam is in crisis and reiterated the Republic's secular values. For a moment, it seemed that the West might finally draw a line. But the backlash came not from Islamists alone. Western liberals, journalists, and academics accused Macron of Islamophobia and of stigmatizing Muslims. Rather than rallying in defense of Paty's pedagogical freedom, international media focused on the hurt feelings of France's Muslim community. Here lies the crux of the matter. A man was decapitated for teaching freedom of expression, and the conversation immediately shifted to how not to offend the ideology that fueled the murder. This is the logic of a society that has surrendered its civilizational confidence. The proper response in this case would have meant naming the ideology behind the act without euphemism or cowardice. It would have meant asking why Islamic teachings about blasphemy, martyrdom, and apostasy continue to find violent expression in secular societies. But such questions are forbidden. To ask them is to risk social exile, professional ruin, or physical violence. Europe is caught between its post-Christian guilt and a demographic reality it refuses to confront. The growing influence of political Islam within immigrant communities has paralyzed secular governments that fear urban unrest more than ideological rot. The result is a de facto blasphemy law, enforced not by the state but by mobs and enabled by journalists and academics who have confused cowardice for virtue. Gender apartheid and the myth of multicultural feminism, Iran and Afghanistan. Consider the situation of women in Iran and Afghanistan, two countries where Islam is not merely a personal faith, but the spine of the legal and political systems. In Iran, the morality police roam the streets like medieval inquisitors, dragging unveiled women into vans, administering beatings, and handing out prison sentences for uncovering their hair and wearing lipstick. In Afghanistan, the Taliban have turned girls' schools into ruins and enforced a regime where women cannot travel without male guardians, work in public, or even visit parks. And yet, in Western feminist circles, there is a deafening silence. The energy once reserved for denouncing patriarchy and defending female autonomy now dissipates into platitudes about respecting cultures and not imposing Western values. The same activists who rail against gender roles in The Handmaid's Tale avert their eyes when the real-life Gilead is governed by bearded clerics quoting hadith. When Muslim women do rise to challenge these theocracies, from Nargiz Mohammadi in Iran to the countless Afghan girls defying the Taliban, they are often left unsupported by their Western counterparts. Worse, their critics within the Muslim world are vilified as Islamophobic. The inversion is grotesque. To fight for women's rights under Islamic regimes is framed as bigotry, while defending the orthodoxy that crushes them is seen as cultural sensitivity. Concern over Islam, then, is not irrational. It is a response to a global pattern of religious totalitarianism that disproportionately harms the most vulnerable: women, apostates, minorities, and dissenters. If there is any place for fear and loathing in modern ethics, it should be reserved for systems that normalize subjugation in the name of the divine. The global silence on apostasy, death for leaving Islam. One of the most chilling aspects of Islam is its treatment of apostasy. In no other major religion today is the act of leaving the faith legally punishable by death in multiple nation-states. 13 countries, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia, impose the death penalty or long prison terms for apostasy, all based on Islamic jurisprudence derived from the Hadith and Sharia. These are not fringe interpretations. They are the mainstream. In 2020, a young Nigerian man named Mubarak Bala, president of the Humanist Association of Nigeria, was imprisoned for blasphemy after merely expressing atheist views online. Sentenced to 24 years in a sham trial, his case drew some attention from international secular organizations, but deafening silence from Muslim groups. Not one prominent Muslim cleric or body issued a fatwa in defense of his freedom of conscience. Why? Because within the framework of traditional Islam, leaving the faith is an unforgivable crime. Even in secular democracies, ex-Muslims live in fear. In the United Kingdom, apostates often face ostracism, honor violence, or threats from their own families and communities. Former Muslims, such as Ali Rizvi, Sarah Haider, and Faisal Said al-Muhtar, have spoken of receiving death threats, not from government actors, but from private Muslims who believe they are fulfilling religious duty by silencing dissenters. Here again, the term Islamophobia is employed as a gag order. To point out that Islam uniquely punishes apostasy with death is labeled racist or intolerant. But the intolerance is not in the observation, it is in the ideology being observed. A religion that kills people for changing their minds is incompatible with a liberal worldview. The fear of Islam, in this case, is not pathological. It is protective. It is moral. Where are the brave liberal voices who claim to champion freedom of belief? Silent. Afraid. Hiding behind the shield of cultural relativism while their supposed values are trampled under the banner of Allahu Akbar. The reasonable fear of Islam, what its enemies call Islamophobia, is in fact the natural reaction of any society that values life over lawlessness, truth over tyranny, reason over revelation. Pakistan, blasphemy and the murder of reason. Pakistan remains the perfect case study in the rational foundation for concern over Islam. This is a nation where mobs lynch children for misspeaking about the Prophet, where entire Christian communities are burned to the ground based on rumors, and where the government itself enables and enshrines these barbarities into law. The infamous blasphemy laws, particularly Article 295C of the Pakistan Penal Code, mandate the death penalty for any insult, real or imagined, to Muhammad. Consider the case of Mashal Khan, a university student lynched in 2017 by fellow students who accused him of blasphemy on Facebook. He was dragged from his hostel, stripped, beaten, and shot. No evidence of his supposed blasphemy was ever produced, because none was needed. His murderers, many of whom were caught on video chanting religious slogans over his body, were treated as heroes by parts of the public. The few who expressed outrage were swiftly labeled traitors, or, you guessed it, Islamophobes. And what of Asia Bibi, a Christian woman sentenced to death in 2010 for allegedly drinking from the same water cup as Muslim women? Her case took nearly a decade to resolve. Two officials who defended her, Salman Taseer and Shahbaz Bhatti, were murdered. Taseer was shot 27 times by his own bodyguard, who was later celebrated by thousands as a Ghazi, religious warrior. Mosques were named after the killer. Textbooks praised him. This was not fringe sentiment. This was the mainstream. Is it irrational to fear an ideology that justifies this madness? Is it bigotry to reject a belief system whose laws would have you executed for doubting their divine source? To fear this is not to be prejudiced. It is to be awake. Sweden, Quran burnings, and the death of free speech. In 2023 and 2024, Sweden and Denmark became unlikely battlegrounds in the global war over religious sensitivity. Several individuals burned copies of the Quran in public protests, acts that, however provocative, were explicitly aimed at testing the limits of free expression. The response was predictable and grotesque: international condemnation, embassy attacks, and threats of violence. Citizens of Sweden, a secular democracy with liberal traditions, was accused of Islamophobia by those in Muslim-majority nations such as Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. Massive protests erupted across the Islamic world. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, called for blasphemy to be recognized as an international crime. This is not a satire. This is the 21st century. Instead of standing firm, Swedish officials began apologizing. Laws were proposed to limit Quran burnings, not because they violated any liberal principle, but because they provoked Muslims. Once again, the sacred demanded and received special protections. There was no such outrage when Bibles were burned or when Christian symbols were mocked in art galleries. Only one religion seems to require worldwide compliance with its taboos. This is the heart of the problem. Islam does not merely seek to be respected, it demands submission, not just from believers, but from everyone. Its sacred symbols are not just personal, they are political weapons. To criticize, mock, or reject them is to invite not debate, but reprisal. What is being demonized as Islamophobia is often nothing more than a refusal to bow. It is not irrational to oppose theocratic coercion disguised as cultural sensitivity. It is not hateful to reject religious totalitarianism. It is, in fact, the duty of every sane mind. If anything, what the Quran burnings proved is that Europe's commitment to free speech is paper-thin. The West trembles before the fury of Islam while congratulating itself for tolerance. But there is nothing tolerant about abandoning your principles to avoid conflict. That is not virtue. It is cowardice. Conclusion: the right to offend, the duty to question. Islamophobia, as currently defined, is a lie. A linguistic trap designed to paralyze criticism and punish dissent. It takes the legitimate fears of apostates, feminists, intellectuals, and freethinkers and recasts them as hate. It is the blasphemy law of the global age, enforced not by state edict, but by cultural cowardice. But in truth, the most dangerous people in the world today are not those who burn Qurans or draw cartoons. They are those who would kill for books or demand blood for drawings. It is no accident that Islam remains the only major world religion whose adherents routinely riot, murder, or issue death threats in response to satire. The fear is not phobic, it is empirical, based on evidence, supported by facts, fueled by experiences that stretch from Tehran to Toulouse, from Lahore to London. The Enlightenment taught us to question everything, especially authority that claims divine sanction. Islam, in its most orthodox forms, commands us to submit. These cannot coexist. The West must choose. Will it continue its descent into masochistic silence, sacrificing reason on the altar of cultural relativism? Or will it reclaim the values that gave it science, human rights, and liberty, all of which were born in rebellion against religious tyranny? Refusal to make Islam immune from criticism is not a moral crime. It is an act of resistance, a line in the sand, the last defense of reason. Let it not be erased. Thank you for listening to this audio edition of Free Inquiry, the journal for secular humanist ideas. If you enjoyed this article, consider subscribing to Free Inquiry magazine to explore more thought-provoking content on reason, ethics, science, and free thought. You can find more articles, subscribe, or support our work at secularhumanism.org. There you'll also discover resources on secular humanism, information on upcoming events, and ways to connect with a community of like-minded thinkers. If you believe in the importance of reason, free expression, and humanist values, consider making a donation to support our work. Every contribution helps us continue to publish, advocate, and provide resources for a more rational, secular world. Once again, thanks for listening and for supporting free inquiry, free minds, and free expression.